Welcome, Biblical Theology scholars. I had planned on doing this video last week, but it kind of got away from me. Turns out it was a pretty good um, talk to prepare in response to your discussion questions for this week. So I wanted to give you an example of biblical theology. So I thought I would tackle a question that's come up a couple of times already. How were people in the Old Testament saved? They were never saved through keeping the law. Jesus is clear about that. The law actually condemns people, it doesn't save people. They were never saved through the Old Testament sacrificial system. As Hebrews tells us, that system was just shadows and copies of the real thing which is to come. So the Bible tells us that Old Testament people were saved in the same way we are saved, through faith, right? This is what is stated in Genesis 15:6, that Abram believed and it was credited to him as righteousness. And this phrase is quoted four times in the New Testament: Romans 4, Galatians 3, James 2, and Hebrews 11, I believe. So the New Testament writers went out of their way to show that uh, the mechanism for salvation was the same in the Old Testament and the New Testament. But this begs one question: faith in what? What did Abram believe in? And here's where I get to talk about the progressive nature of revelation. That when God revealed himself, when he reveals his plan of redemption, he didn't reveal it all at once, right? He revealed it uh, in stages and increasingly throughout biblical history, right? So everything that we need to know about the gospel is actually already in the book of Genesis. Genesis 3:15 tells us that the serpent would strike his heel and he will crush his head, right? This is God's promise to undo all the damage Adam did through the fall. Curious thing about this verse: that pronoun he, the serpent will strike his heel and he will crush his head. Usually, when you have a pronoun, it has an antecedent, something it refers back to. But grammatically, here, there is no antecedent. That pronoun he actually points forward to someone, not back to someone, right? Genesis 9:27. We have another part of the gospel in the book of Genesis. This is a little tricky because the NIV does not render this very well. It states that let him dwell in the tents of Shem. Now, the NIV says let Japheth dwell in the tents of Shem. They have the wrong antecedent there. It's let God dwell in the tents of Shem. Genesis 9:27 is God's promise to dwell with us. Then we get to Genesis 12:1 through 3, with Abram and the 8 promises that God gives Abram. And the last one is that he will be a blessing to many nations, right? So after this, we have the statement in Genesis 15:6 that Abram believed and it was credited to him as righteousness. Then we have this really odd ceremony where God asks Abram to gather some birds and a calf and a heifer and split them in half. Not the birds, they're already pretty small, and arrange them like a corridor, right? This was an ancient treaty sealing ceremony. When two kings would enter into a treaty with one another, they would conclude their treaty with this ceremony. Basically, what they're saying is, look, if I don't hold up my end of the bargain in this treaty, this is what I pledge can happen to me. I should be cut in half, right? But an interesting thing happens. God causes Abram to fall asleep, and God passes between the broken animals himself as a smoldering cauldron, right? This is God's unilateral promise to bring about what he has promised, right? Through Genesis 3:15, Genesis 9:27, and Genesis 12:1 through 3. This forms the basis for what is called the tripartite formula. And Duvall and Hayes has already talked about this, I believe. This tripartite formula: I will be your God, you will be my people, and I will dwell in the midst of you. This tripartite formula is repeated either in whole or in part over 800 times throughout the Bible. And the three parts of it derive from these three promises in Genesis. Genesis 3:15. He will strike his heel, and he will, or you, the serpent, will strike his heel, and he will crush your head. That's a promise to be our God. Genesis 12:3, that Abram will be a blessing to many nations, that we will be his people. In Genesis 9:27, that God will dwell in the midst of us, right? So Old Testament people were saved by faith in the promise, right? Old Testament believers did not know the name of the promised one, but they still believed in the same promise we do. We just happen to live in a time and place in history where we know the name of the promised one, right? The Old Testament, New Testament believers still have faith in the same thing. We may know more about it than they do, but it's still the same thing. I'm trying to come up with an analogy. If I'm it, if my son roots for his father's favorite baseball team and my daughter roots for the Red Sox, they're both cheering for the same team, right? Now, my son may not know. Well, of course, my son knows what my favorite baseball team is, right? But even if my son didn't know what my favorite baseball team is, in theory, they would still be cheering for the same person. And this is why Revelation is known as progressive, is that God starts with a little bit of information, and as we go throughout the Bible, he gives more and more and more information. Now, a lot of times we think of this in terms of like a prophecy fulfillment scheme, and that's part of it. But I think promise is actually more powerful than prophecy. So let me give you an example of progressive revelation. And this is where it kind of dovetails with our reading for this week. Let's take one of these three elements of the tripartite formula, this promise in Genesis 9:27 that God will dwell with man, right? We can see that God takes bigger and bigger steps to see this happen. At first, God sets up a system of a tabernacle, a temporary, portable place where his presence can dwell, right? And that's where, the cloud came down and the earth shook because God's presence was in the tabernacle. Now, most of my church, if I was to ask them what their least favorite book is, would probably say Numbers. And they'd say Numbers for a very curious reason, because I guarantee you most people in my church have tried to read through the Bible at some point and they gave up about the book of Numbers, right? They didn't get to Obadiah, they didn't even get to Ezekiel. So if they ever got to Obadiah, well, maybe Obadiah might be their least favorite book, but a lot of people say Numbers. Well, when we understand what's going on in Numbers, it becomes fascinating because we're taking a census of the nation of Israel, and God arranges them in a horseshoe pattern around the tabernacle. So when Israel is encamped around the tabernacle, God is literally dwelling in the midst of his people, right? But this tabernacle was never designed to be a permanent solution. It was only a placeholder. It had built-in obsolescence. So then when we get to Solomon, Solomon builds a temple for God. He has a permanent place, right? But even the temple was never designed to be permanent. It had a built-in obsolescence. And we know this because there's no temple right now. Well, there is, but it's not in Jerusalem. 1 Corinthians 3 and 1 Corinthians 6 tell us that our heart is now the temple. So now we see God is taking bigger and bigger steps to fulfill this promise to dwell with us. It started with God sometimes being with Abraham, sometimes not, sometimes being with Jacob, sometimes not. Then it moved to the tabernacle, then it moved to the temple. Now, through the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, our hearts are the temple. Our hearts are the place where God's presence dwells. But Revelation 21 suggests that there might even be an even more amazing fulfillment of this. So Revelation 21 states, "Now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will be their God, and they will be his people." That's pretty amazing that these three promises are given in the first 11 chapters and 3 verses of Genesis. And that same language is used at the very end of the Bible. And that same language is repeated over 800 times throughout the Bible, right? So we can see God's progressive revelation means that at any point along that timeline, no one person is going to know all of it, not until glorification, right? Not until we get to Revelation chapter 21. And this is the one plan of God, the one plan of God for redemption that's unveiled progressively throughout history. Now, we are probably towards the end of that progressive revelation. Abram was at the very beginning of it, but it's still faith in the one plan. This is the gospel. And this is where I think some of you got tripped up because you read Francis Watson and you read Duvall and Hayes, and you assumed that you had to choose between the two. Watson suggests the center of the scriptures is the gospel. And Duvall and Hayes talk about the center of the scriptures as being God's relational presence. Well, my question is, what is the gospel? Isn't the gospel God's relational presence? This promise to dwell with us, right? The gospel is not just the historical facts that Jesus became man and he lived the life that we should have lived and he died the death that we should have died and he rose again on the cross and he ascended into heaven. Those are the historical facts of the gospel. But the point of the gospel is not to convince us that a man named Jesus lived and a man named Jesus died and a man named Jesus rose again. Actually, you might be fascinated to know this. You will be hard pressed to find any New Testament scholar, Christian or secular, that doesn't believe that the tomb is empty. And you have to take my word for it. Look up Gary Habermas and his work. He demonstrates fairly clearly that the consensus of New Testament scholarship, evangelical, liberal, or atheist, agrees that the tomb was empty. So the gospel isn't just the historical facts that Jesus lived, that Jesus died, that Jesus rose again. Why did Jesus come to earth? Emmanuel, God with us. Why did Jesus die and pay the penalty for our sins? Why did Jesus rise again? It's so that we could have a relationship with God, so that we could experience the presence of God. So Watson and Duvall and Hayes may be approaching this from different angles, but they come to the same conclusion. The center of the scriptures, the thing that makes all of the scriptures make sense, is this theme of God's relational presence. That is the gospel. Now, I would argue that the central theme might be a little broader than that, right? This tripartite formula. I will be your God, they will be my people, and I will dwell in the midst of them. Um, that right there is the center of the gospel. Duvall and Hayes really focus on that one dwelling part, and I think it's helpful. Although I think it might be a little broader than that. That's okay. Duvall and Hayes and I can disagree about that. But I did want you to know that Watson and Duvall and Hayes are not advocating two different things. They're advocating the same thing. Well, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it answered more questions than it may have generated. I love questions about this, so if I was not very clear, please send me an email and I will respond to you, or I will redo this if that's appropriate. But I appreciate your guys' hard work. I'm actually enjoying grading your stuff now, and I just encourage you to keep up the good work. Have a good day.